Welcome to Self-Development 101, the home of deep-dive documentaries on the psychology, sociology, and systems that shape our modern lives. If you are tired of surface-level advice, subscribe to join a community of thinkers who are rebuilding their lives, one insight at a time. In this documentary, we will not just discuss focus. We will deconstruct the biology of attention, examine the economic architecture that profits from its destruction, and expose the neurochemical mechanisms that make concentration feel impossible in the modern world. You will learn why your inability to focus is not a personal failing, but a predictable response to a deliberately engineered environment. More importantly, you will understand the exact systems required to rebuild your capacity for what Cal Newport calls deep work, the ability to focus without distraction on a cognitively demanding task. This is not motivational content. This is a technical manual for the most valuable skill in the 21st century economy. Let me begin with a proposition that will fundamentally reframe how you understand your relationship with work. In 1971, the economist Herbert Simon published a paper that would predict the central crisis of modern knowledge work decades before the internet existed. He wrote that, in an information-rich world, attention becomes the scarce resource. Information consumes the attention of its recipients, and a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. Simon was describing what we now call the attention economy, a term that has been diluted through overuse, but represents a precise economic model. Your attention is not merely valuable. It is the oil of the digital age, the raw material that every platform, every application, and every notification system is designed to extract and monetize. The mechanics of this extraction are not abstract. When you open your phone and see a red notification badge, you are experiencing the endpoint of a sophisticated behavioral engineering system. That red dot is not accidental. It is the product of A/B testing, conducted on millions of users to determine which color, which shape, and which placement produces the highest click-through rate. The color red specifically was chosen because it triggers a threat response in the amygdala, the brain's fear center. Your nervous system interprets that red badge as a signal of social danger, of missing something important, of being excluded from the tribe. This is not hyperbole. This is the documented design philosophy of growth teams at major technology companies, many of whom have since left those companies and publicly discussed the psychological manipulation techniques they were instructed to implement in the tribe. This is not hyperbole. This is the documented design philosophy of growth teams at major technology companies, many of whom have since left those companies and publicly discussed the psychological manipulation techniques they were instructed to implement. The economic incentive structure here is brutally simple. Social media platforms generate revenue by selling advertising. The value of that advertising is determined by how long users spend on the platform and how accurately the platform can predict user behavior. Every second you spend scrolling is a second during which your behavior is being monitored, quantified, and packaged into a data product sold to advertisers. The platform's entire business model depends on maximizing what is called engagement, which is a euphemism for addiction. The longer you stay, the more data they collect, and the more precisely they can target advertisements. Your attention is not the product being sold. You are not the customer. You are the inventory. To understand why this system is so effective, we must examine the neurochemical mechanism it exploits. The human brain did not evolve in an environment of information abundance. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, information was scarce and valuable. When you learned something new, when you discovered where food was located, when you heard gossip about your tribe, your brain released dopamine. Dopamine is often mischaracterized as the pleasure chemical. but that is not technically accurate. Dopamine is the anticipation chemical. It is released not when you receive a reward, but when you anticipate receiving a reward. This distinction is critical because it explains why you check your phone compulsively, even when you know, consciously, that there will likely be nothing important waiting for you. Every time you unlock your phone, you are engaging with what behavioral psychologists call a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, the most addictive reward pattern known to neuroscience. This is the same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive. Sometimes you check your phone, and there is nothing. Sometimes there is a like. Sometimes there is a message from someone you care about. Sometimes there is news that makes you angry or excited. The variability of the reward is what keeps you checking. If you knew with certainty that nothing would be there, you would stop checking. If you knew with certainty that something important would always be there, you would check less frequently. But the uncertainty, the possibility of reward, creates a dopamine spike every single time you reach for your phone. Your brain has learned that checking the phone might produce a reward, and so it craves that check, the same way a gambler craves pulling the slot machine lever. The neuroplasticity implications of this pattern are severe. Every time you engage in this behavior, you are strengthening the neural pathway that associates phone checking with potential reward. Over time, this pathway becomes automatic. You check your phone without conscious thought. You unlock it, scroll for 30 seconds, lock it again, and then unlock it 90 seconds later without remembering that you just checked it. This is not a moral failing. This is Hebbian learning, the principle that neurons that fire together wire together. Your brain has been trained through thousands of repetitions to seek micro hits of dopamine by checking your phone. The more you engage in this behavior, the stronger the neural pathway becomes, and the harder it is to resist the urge. Let us examine the precise neurological architecture of this addiction at the cellular level. When you anticipate checking your phone, neurons in your ventral tegmental area, a small region in the midbrain, begin firing. These neurons are dopaminergic, meaning they release dopamine as their primary neurotransmitter. The dopamine travels along axons that project to your nucleus accumbens, part of the ventral striatum, which is the brain's reward prediction center. When dopamine binds to DNMA2 receptors on neurons in the nucleus accumbens, it creates the sensation of wanting. This is distinct from liking. The neuroscientist Kent Berridge has spent decades demonstrating that wanting and liking are mediated by separate neural systems. Dopamine creates wanting. Opioids create liking. This is why you can want to check your phone compulsively, even when you do not actually enjoy the experience once you are scrolling. The variable ratio reinforcement schedule that characterizes phone checking creates a specific pattern of dopamine release that is distinct from predictable rewards. If you knew with certainty that checking your phone would always produce a reward, your dopamine would spike when you received the reward. But because the reward is unpredictable, your dopamine spikes in anticipation of checking, during the checking behavior itself. And this spike is sustained until you either find a reward or conclude that no reward is coming. This sustained elevation of dopamine is what makes the behavior so compulsive. Your brain is essentially gambling, and the dopamine system is designed to make gambling feel compelling. The long-term consequences of this pattern extend beyond mere habit formation. Chronic exposure to variable rewards causes downregulation of dopamine receptors. Your brain, in an attempt to maintain homeostasis, reduces the number of dopamine receptors on the neurons in your nucleus accumbens. This is a protective mechanism. If dopamine levels are chronically elevated, reducing receptor density brings your baseline reward sensitivity back toward normal. But this adaptation has a severe cost. Once your dopamine receptors are downregulated, you need larger dopamine spikes to experience the same level of wanting. Normal rewards, things that used to feel satisfying like completing work or having a conversation, no longer produce enough dopamine to activate your reward system effectively. You have become desensitized. This is the mechanism of tolerance, the same mechanism that underlies drug addiction. You need increasingly intense stimulation to feel normal. The recovery of dopamine receptor density is possible, but slow. Studies on dopamine receptor recovery in substance abuse patients suggest that it can take months to years of abstinence for receptor density to return to baseline. The timeline varies by individual and depends on how long the system has been dysregulated. A 20-year-old who has been using social media compulsively for 3 years may recover faster than a 35-year-old who has been using it for 15 years. But the principle is universal. If you want to restore your baseline capacity for focus and for experiencing satisfaction from non-stimulating activities, you must reduce your exposure to the variable rewards of digital technology. This is not optional if you want to do deep work. A desensitized dopamine system cannot sustain focus on demanding tasks because demanding tasks produce dopamine slowly and gradually, not in the intense spikes that a desensitized system requires. The prefrontal cortex damage associated with chronic distraction is mediated by a different but related mechanism. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is the brain region responsible for executive function, which includes working memory, impulse control, planning, and the ability to sustain attention on tasks that are not inherently rewarding. Executive function is metabolically expensive. It requires sustained activation of prefrontal neurons, which consumes glucose and oxygen at rates significantly higher than baseline brain metabolism. When you engage in executive function tasks, you are essentially running your prefrontal cortex at maximum capacity. The problem is that the prefrontal cortex competes with other brain regions for metabolic resources, and it also competes for attentional resources. When you are constantly distracted, constantly switching tasks, constantly processing notifications, you are training your brain to allocate resources away from the prefrontal cortex and toward the more primitive, stimulus-driven regions of the brain, like the amygdala and the striatum. Over time, this pattern of resource allocation becomes default. Your brain learns that sustained prefrontal activation is not required because you never demand it. The neural circuits that support executive function begin to atrophy through disuse, while the circuits that support impulsive, reactive behavior strengthen through constant use. Research using structural MRI has documented actual changes in gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex associated with chronic media multitasking. A study published in 2018 by researchers at Stanford University found that people who engage in frequent media multitasking show reduced gray matter density in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region critical for executive control and attention. This is not correlation. Longitudinal studies tracking individuals over time show that increased media multitasking predicts decreased gray matter density, suggesting a causal relationship. You are literally shrinking the part of your brain responsible for focus. But the damage extends beyond mere distraction. The constant switching between tasks, between your work and your phone, between deep thinking and shallow scrolling creates what University of Minimalism. Researcher Sophie Leroy calls attention residue. In her studies published in 2009, Leroy demonstrated that when you switch from task A to task B, your attention does not immediately follow. A residue of your attention remains stuck on task A. If you were writing code and you stop to check email, part of your cognitive capacity remains allocated to thinking about that code, even as you are reading emails. This means you are not fully present in either task. You are neither writing code effectively nor processing emails effectively. You are operating at diminished capacity in both domains. The mechanism of attention residue is related to how working memory functions in the prefrontal cortex. Working memory is not like RAM in a computer, where you can instantly load and unload programs. Working memory is more like a slowly fading whiteboard. When you write something on a whiteboard and then start writing something else, the old writing does not disappear instantly. It fades gradually, leaving ghostly traces that interfere with your ability to read the new writing clearly. Every task switch is cognitive vandalism, scribbling over your mental whiteboard before the previous work has fully faded. The research shows that this residue can persist for 10 to 15 minutes after a task switch. If you are checking your phone every 10 minutes, which multiple studies suggest is the median frequency for knowledge workers, you are never operating at full cognitive capacity. You are permanently working in a state of attention residue. Let us deconstruct the working memory system with more precision to understand why this residue occurs. Working memory is not a single system, but a collection of subsystems, as proposed by Alan Baddeley and Graham Hitch in their influential 1974 model. The central executive is the attentional control system that coordinates the other components and allocates cognitive resources. The phonological loop maintains verbal and acoustic information through subvocal rehearsal. The visuospatial sketchpad maintains visual and spatial information. The episodic buffer, added to the model later, integrates information from multiple sources into coherent episodes. When you are working on a complex task, all of these systems are active simultaneously, maintaining different aspects of the task in temporary storage. When you switch tasks, the central executive must redirect attention to the new task, but the other components do not instantly clear their contents. The phonological loop may still be rehearsing a phrase from the document you were writing. The visuospatial sketchpad may still hold the image of the code structure you were examining. The episodic buffer may still contain the narrative of the problem you were solving. All of this information continues to occupy cognitive capacity, reducing what is available for the new task. The central executive must actively suppress this residual information, which itself consumes cognitive resources. You are using mental energy to not think about the previous task, energy that could otherwise be devoted to the current task. The research methodology Leroy used to demonstrate attention residue is worth examining because it reveals just how robust this effect is. She conducted experiments where participants were given task A to work on, then interrupted and given task B, then returned to task A. Between task A and task B, some participants were given a transition period where they were told they would return to task A later, while others were told they were finished with task A. The participants who believed they would return to task A showed significantly more attention residue and performed worse on task B. Their minds could not let go of the unfinished task A. This aligns with the Zeigarnik effect, discovered by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in 1927, which demonstrates that people remember uncompleted tasks better than completed tasks because the mind maintains active representations of unfinished business. The practical implication is that closing loops matters enormously. If you must interrupt your deep work to handle something urgent, you should close the cognitive loop before switching. This might mean writing down exactly where you were and what you were thinking, so your mind knows the information is captured and does not need to actively maintain it. This externalization of working memory is why writing things down is so cognitively powerful. You are offloading information from your biological memory system, which has limited capacity, to an external system that has essentially unlimited capacity. David Allen's Getting Things Done methodology is built entirely on this principle. Capture everything in a trusted external system so your mind can stop using cycles to remember it. Leroy's research also revealed an asymmetry in attention residue that is particularly relevant to knowledge work. The residue is stronger when you switch away from a task that is important to you and switch toward a task that is less important. If you are working on a project that you care deeply about and you stop to answer a trivial email, the residue of the important project haunts you as you read the email. Your brain knows at some level that you have abandoned something meaningful to engage with something trivial, and it resists fully committing to the trivial task. This creates a state of chronic low-grade stress. You feel guilty about not working on the important thing, but you also cannot fully engage with the unimportant thing because part of your mind is still back at the important thing. This is the psychological architecture of modern burnout. The neural substrate of this guilt and stress response involves the anterior cingulate cortex, a region that monitors for conflict and error. When you switch from a high-value task to a low-value task, your ACC detects the discrepancy between what you should be doing and what you are doing. This conflict detection triggers activation of the sympathetic nervous system, releasing cortisol and adrenaline. In acute doses, these stress hormones enhance focus by mobilizing resources. But when the conflict is chronic, when you are constantly switching between important and trivial tasks, the stress response becomes maladaptive. Chronic cortisol elevation impairs hippocampal function, reducing your ability to form new memories. It also impairs prefrontal function, reducing your ability to resist further distractions. You enter a vicious cycle where distraction creates stress. Stress impairs executive function. Impaired executive function makes you more susceptible to distraction, and the cycle accelerates. The temporal dynamics of attention residue reveal why the frequency of task switching matters more than the duration of each interruption. A single 5-minute interruption might create attention residue that persists for 15 minutes. If you experience 4 such interruptions per hour, you spend the entire hour operating with attention residue. You never achieve a clean cognitive state. This is different from experiencing one 30-minute interruption per hour. A 30-minute interruption is still costly, but after the interruption ends, your attention can fully clear and you can return to peak capacity for the remaining 30 minutes. The math of cognitive fragmentation is not linear. 10 small interruptions are much more damaging than one large interruption of equivalent total time. Research on the cognitive cost of interruptions, conducted at the University of California. Irvine by Gloria Mark and her colleagues found that after an interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes to return to the original task. And even then, people typically work on 2 other tasks before getting back to the interrupted task. This means a single interruption can cascade into an hour of fragmented work. The researchers also found that people compensate for interruptions by working faster. But this speed comes at the cost of increased stress, higher frustration, and more errors. You can mask the productivity impact of interruptions through sheer effort, but you cannot avoid the psychological and quality costs. The specific characteristics of interruptions determine their severity. Interruptions that are task-relevant, meaning they provide information related to your current task, are less damaging than interruptions that are completely unrelated. If you are writing a report and someone sends you data relevant to that report, the interruption may actually be beneficial because it provides needed information. But if you are writing a report and someone asks you about an unrelated project, the cognitive context switch is complete and the residue is maximal. This distinction matters for designing communication protocols. If interruptions are inevitable, they should at least be batched by topic to minimize context switching, the phenomenon that researchers call resumption lag. The time it takes to resume a task after an interruption is influenced by multiple factors. Complex tasks show longer resumption lags than simple tasks because there is more cognitive context to reconstruct. Tasks that you have been working on for longer show shorter resumption lags than tasks you just started because the mental model is more developed and easier to reactivate. Interruptions that occur at natural breakpoints in a task show shorter resumption lags than interruptions that occur midstream because less cognitive context is lost. All of this points to the strategic importance of structuring work into chunks with natural boundaries and protecting those chunks from interruption until the boundary is reached. The economic opportunity cost of this cognitive fragmentation is staggering when you calculate it over a career. Let us construct a simple model. Assume you are a knowledge worker who earns your living through cognitive output, whether that is writing code, designing systems, producing research, or creating content. Assume your peak cognitive capacity, when you are in a state of full focus, allows you to produce 10 units of valuable output per hour. This output could be measured in lines of quality code, pages of clear writing, or strategic insights. Now assume that when you are operating in a fragmented attention state, with constant task switching and attention residue, your output drops to 3 units per hour. This is not an exaggeration. Many researchers estimate the productivity loss from distraction and multitasking to be in the range of 60 to 80%. If you work 8 hours per day, and you spend 6 of those hours in a fragmented state and 2 hours in a focused state, you are producing 38 units of output per day. 2 hours at 10 units per hour equals 20 units, and 6 hours at 3 units per hour equals 18 units. But if you could spend 6 hours in a focused state and reduce the fragmented time to 2 hours, you would produce 66 units per day. That is a 74% increase in output for the same amount of time worked. Over the course of a year, this difference compounds. Over the course of a decade, this difference is the gap between mediocrity and mastery, between plateau and exponential growth, between being replaceable and being irreplaceable in an economy where artificial intelligence is automating routine cognitive work at an accelerating pace. This brings us to the central thesis of Cal Newport's deep work hypothesis, which he published in 20 after years of research into the productivity habits of elite performers. Newport argues that the ability to perform deep work, which he defines as professional activities performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive capabilities to their limit, is becoming simultaneously more valuable and more rare. The value increases because in a world where AI can handle routine cognitive tasks, the only remaining sources of human competitive advantage are the ability to master hard things quickly and the ability to produce at an elite level. Both of these require deep work. The rarity increases because the entire technological and social infrastructure of modern life is optimized for fragmentation, not focus. Newport documents that deep work is not simply about working hard or working long hours. It is about working in a specific cognitive state, characterized by total absorption in a demanding task. This state has been studied extensively by the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who spent decades researching what he calls flow, a state of effortless concentration so focused that it amounts to absolute absorption in an activity. Csikszentmihalyi's research, which began in the 1960s and has produced hundreds of studies and thousands of citations, reveals that flow states are not mystical or random. They occur under specific, reproducible conditions. The first condition is that the task must have clear goals. Your brain cannot enter a flow state if it does not know what it is trying to accomplish. Ambiguity is the enemy of flow. If you sit down to work and your goal is vague, such as make progress on the project, your prefrontal cortex will spend cognitive resources trying to define what progress means, trying to decide which subtask to tackle first, and monitoring whether you are doing the right thing. All of this consumes working memory capacity that could otherwise be devoted to the task itself. But if your goal is specific, such as write the function that parses the JSON input and validates the schema, your brain can allocate all of its resources to executing that concrete goal. The clarity eliminates the cognitive overhead of decision-making. The second condition is that the task must provide immediate feedback. You need to know, moment by moment, whether you are succeeding or failing at the task. This feedback loop is what allows your brain to stay locked on to the task. If you are writing code and you run it and it works, that is immediate feedback. If you are solving a math problem and you check your work and the answer is correct, that is immediate feedback. If you are writing and you read what you just wrote and it captures the idea you were trying to express, that is immediate feedback. Without this feedback, your attention begins to drift because your brain has no way to know whether it is on the right track. The third condition is that the challenge level of the task must match your skill level. If the task is too easy, you become bored. If the task is too hard, you become anxious. Flow occurs in the narrow channel between boredom and anxiety, where the task is difficult enough to demand your full attention, but not so difficult that you feel overwhelmed. Csikszentmihalyi describes this as the zone of optimal challenge. This explains why beginners experience flow when learning a new skill. They have not yet developed enough skill for any task to feel optimally challenging rather than overwhelming. As skill increases, the range of tasks that can produce flow expands, but the task difficulty must continuously increase to maintain the optimal challenge ratio. This is why elite performers often say that they are pursuing mastery not for external rewards, but because the pursuit itself is intrinsically rewarding. They have spent so many hours in flow states that they have become, in Csikszentmihalyi's term, autotelic, meaning they engage in the activity for its own sake rather than for external outcomes. The neurochemistry of flow states reveals why these experiences feel so rewarding. When you enter a flow state, your brain releases a cascade of neurochemicals, including dopamine, norepinephrine, endorphins, anandamide, and serotonin. Dopamine and norepinephrine increase focus and pattern recognition. Endorphins dull pain and create a sense of euphoria. Anandamide enhances lateral thinking, and creative connection between ideas. Serotonin produces a sense of well-being. This neurochemical cocktail is why people who regularly achieve flow states often describe them as the most satisfying experiences of their lives, and why some researchers have compared flow to a natural high. You are not imagining that deep work feels good. It literally activates the same reward circuits that are activated by drugs, sex, and food. But it does so in a sustainable way that builds rather than depletes your capacity. Let us examine each of these neurochemicals in the specific context of their contribution to the flow state. Dopamine, as we discussed earlier, is the anticipation molecule, but it also enhances pattern recognition by increasing signal-to-noise ratio in neural processing. When dopamine levels are elevated, the neurons that carry relevant signals fire more vigorously, while background noise is suppressed. This makes it easier for your brain to detect meaningful patterns in complex information. If you are debugging code, elevated dopamine helps you spot the pattern in the error messages that reveals the underlying bug. If you are writing, elevated dopamine helps you recognize the narrative structure that ties your disparate ideas together. This is why flow states are associated with breakthrough insights. Your pattern recognition is operating at peak efficiency. Norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline, is released from the locus coeruleus, a small nucleus in the brainstem that projects throughout the brain. Norepinephrine increases arousal and alertness by making neurons more responsive to incoming signals. It also enhances attention by improving the signal-to-noise ratio in a manner similar to, but distinct from dopamine. While dopamine enhances pattern recognition by amplifying relevant signals, norepinephrine enhances attention by reducing neural responsiveness to irrelevant signals. Together, these two systems create a state of focused awareness where your brain is maximally sensitive to information relevant to your task and maximally insensitive to irrelevant distractions. Endorphins are endogenous opioid peptides, meaning they are opiate-like molecules produced by your own body. The term endorphin is a contraction of endogenous morphine. These molecules bind to opioid receptors in the brain and spinal cord, producing analgesic effects that reduce the perception of pain and effort. This is why athletes describe pushing through pain during intense exercise and entering a state where the pain diminishes or disappears. The same mechanism operates during cognitive flow states. The mental effort of intense concentration would normally feel uncomfortable, even painful in the sense of cognitive strain. But endorphin release during flow reduces that discomfort, allowing you to sustain intense effort without the negative feedback that would normally force you to stop. You can work harder for longer without experiencing it as suffering. Anandamide, named after the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning bliss, is an endogenous cannabinoid. It binds to the same receptors in the brain that THC, the active compound in cannabis, binds to. Anandamide has multiple effects relevant to flow, but the most significant is its enhancement of lateral thinking. Lateral thinking is the ability to make connections between seemingly unrelated concepts, to see non-obvious relationships, to think outside established mental frameworks. This is the cognitive mode associated with creativity and insight. When anandamide levels are elevated, your brain's default mode network, the network active during mind-wandering and creative thinking, becomes more active even as your executive networks remain engaged. This creates a unique cognitive state where you maintain focused attention on your task while simultaneously generating creative associations. You are simultaneously concentrated and expansive, disciplined and imaginative. Serotonin, often called the happiness molecule, although that characterization is oversimplified, contributes to flow states by reducing social anxiety and self-consciousness. One of the defining features of flow is the loss of self-awareness, what Csikszentmihalyi called the loss of ego. When you are in flow, you are not thinking about yourself, not monitoring your performance, not worrying about how you appear to others. You are completely absorbed in the task. Serotonin facilitates this state by dampening activity in brain regions associated with self-referential thinking, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex. When this region is less active, you stop narrating your experience to yourself. You stop evaluating whether you are doing well or poorly. You simply do the work. This reduction in self-referential processing frees up cognitive resources that can be reallocated to the task itself. The hypothesis of transient hypofrontality, proposed by neuroscientist Arne Dietrich in 2003, provides a unifying framework for understanding how these neurochemical changes produce the phenomenology of flow. Hypofrontality means reduced activity in the frontal lobes, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. These regions are responsible for executive functions like planning, metacognition, self-monitoring, and temporal awareness. During flow, these functions are temporarily downregulated. You stop planning multiple steps ahead and simply execute the immediate next action. You stop monitoring your performance and simply perform. You stop being aware of time passing. Dietrich argues that this downregulation is not a side effect of flow, but a core mechanism that enables flow. By temporarily reducing prefrontal activity, your brain frees up metabolic resources that can be devoted to the sensory and motor regions directly involved in task execution. The evidence for transient hypofrontality comes from multiple sources. EEG studies of people in flow states show reduced activity in prefrontal regions and increased activity in sensory and motor regions. The pattern is a redistribution of neural activity away from executive control and toward direct task engagement. fMRI studies show that as people approach flow states, activation shifts from primarily prefrontal networks to primarily sensory motor networks. This shift explains many of the subjective features of flow. The loss of self-consciousness occurs because the medial prefrontal cortex, which generates self-referential thoughts, is less active. The distorted sense of time occurs because the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which maintains temporal awareness, is less active. The feeling of effortless action occurs because explicit executive control is reduced in favor of automatic, proceduralized execution. This has profound implications for skill development. When you are learning a new skill, you must rely heavily on explicit, conscious control. You must think through each step. You must monitor your performance continuously. You must plan ahead. All of this requires intense prefrontal activation, which is why learning is mentally exhausting. But as a skill becomes more practiced, it becomes proceduralized, meaning it is encoded in motor cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum rather than prefrontal cortex. Proceduralized skills can be executed with minimal prefrontal involvement. This is why experts can perform complex actions that look effortless while beginners must concentrate intensely to perform the same actions crudely. The expert has offloaded the skill to subcortical systems, freeing their prefrontal cortex for higher-level strategic thinking. Flow states are only possible once substantial proceduralization has occurred. A complete beginner cannot achieve flow because the skill is not yet proceduralized. They must consciously control every action, which requires continuous prefrontal engagement, which precludes the transient hypofrontality that characterizes flow. But once core elements of the skill are proceduralized, flow becomes accessible. The proceduralized components execute automatically, while the prefrontal cortex coordinates at a higher level of abstraction. And this higher level coordination can itself enter flow as the challenge rises to meet the expanded skill. This creates a recursive relationship between skill development and flow. Flow accelerates skill development by creating optimal conditions for learning. Skill development expands your capacity for flow by making more complex tasks amenable to automatic execution. The two processes amplify each other in a positive feedback loop that characterizes the trajectory of mastery. But here is the critical insight that most discussions of flow miss. Flow states are not just about feeling good. They are about learning. The neurochemical bath that occurs during flow creates optimal conditions for neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural connections. When you are in a flow state, your brain is operating at maximum neuroplasticity. You are not just practicing the skill, you are fundamentally rewiring your neural architecture to make that skill more automatic and more efficient. This is why elite performers in every domain, from chess to surgery to programming, spend the majority of their training time in what Anders Ericsson calls deliberate practice, which is essentially the systematic pursuit of flow states at the edge of their current capability. The specific mechanisms of neuroplasticity during flow involve both structural and functional changes in the brain. At the structural level, repeated activation of specific neural pathways triggers a cascade of molecular events that strengthen synaptic connections. This process begins with calcium ions flooding into the postsynaptic neuron through NMDA receptors, specialized receptors that open only when the neuron is depolarized and a specific neurotransmitter, glutamate, is present. This dual requirement implements what neuroscientists call a coincidence detector. The synapse strengthens only when the presynaptic neuron fires and the postsynaptic neuron is already Hebbian-active, implementing the Hebbian principle that neurons that fire together wire together. The calcium influx triggers protein synthesis, leading to the insertion of new AMPA receptors into the postsynaptic membrane, which makes the synapse more responsive to future glutamate release. Over repeated activations, the synapse physically enlarges, forming new dendritic spines and expanding the surface area of contact between the presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. At the functional level, repeated practice in flow states leads to the formation of what neuroscientists call chunks or schemas, integrated patterns of activation that can be triggered as a single unit rather than as a sequence of individual actions. When a novice chess player looks at a board position, they see individual pieces and must consider each piece's possible moves separately. When a grandmaster looks at the same position, they see familiar patterns, recognizing configurations they have encountered thousands of times before. Each pattern is a chunk, a coordinated pattern of neural activation representing the configuration and its strategic implications. The grandmaster does not consciously process each piece. They recognize the pattern as a unit, the same way you recognize a familiar word without consciously parsing individual letters. This chunking is what allows experts to process information faster and more efficiently than novices. They're operating at a higher level of abstraction, manipulating larger units of information in the same working memory space that novices must allocate to individual elements. The rate of chunking formation is accelerated during flow states because the neurochemical environment during flow is optimal for synaptic modification. Dopamine, in addition to enhancing pattern recognition, also directly facilitates long-term potentiation, the strengthening of synapses that underlies learning. Norepinephrine similarly enhances synaptic plasticity by making neurons more responsive to learning signals. The elevated glucose and oxygen delivery to neural tissue during flow provides the metabolic fuel needed for the energy-intensive process of synaptic remodeling. Every minute you spend in flow is worth more for learning than time spent in ordinary practice, because the biological machinery of learning is operating at maximum efficiency. The economic implication of this neuroplasticity advantage is profound. If you can enter flow states regularly, you learn faster than your competitors. If you learn faster, you can master hard things quickly, which Newport identifies as the first of the two core abilities in the modern economy. And if you can master hard things quickly, you can continuously move into new domains as they become valuable, staying ahead of commoditization and automation. This is the compounding advantage of deep work. It is not just that you produce more output today. It is that you build more capability today, which allows you to produce even more output tomorrow, which builds even more capability the day after. This is exponential growth in human capital. But achieving this state in the modern world requires deliberately architecting your environment and your habits to counteract the default settings of contemporary life. The default is fragmentation. The default is distraction. The default is the path of least resistance, which is shaped by algorithms that profit from your fragmented attention. To do deep work, you must become a systems architect of your own life. You must identify every variable in your environment that influences your ability to sustain focus, and you must systematically optimize each variable. Let us begin with the physical environment. The research on environmental effects on cognition's extensive and consistent. Visual clutter reduces working memory capacity. A study published in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2011 used fMRI imaging to demonstrate that when your visual field contains multiple objects, your brain has to actively suppress processing of the irrelevant objects in order to focus on the relevant object. This suppression consumes working memory resources. If your desk is covered with papers, books, coffee cups, and various objects, your brain is constantly expending effort to filter out visual noise. The effect is small on a per-object basis, but it accumulates. Every object in your visual field that is not relevant to your current task is a micro-tax on your cognitive capacity. The solution is not minimalism for aesthetic reasons. The solution is minimalism for cognitive reasons. Your workspace should contain only the objects that are directly relevant to your current task. If you are writing, you should see your computer and nothing else. If you are reading, you should see the book and nothing else. Every other object should be in a drawer, in a closet, or out of your visual field. This is not about being tidy. This is about reducing cognitive load. Your brain is a finite information processing system, and every bit of processing power you waste on suppressing irrelevant stimuli is processing power you cannot allocate to your work. The auditory environment is equally important. Research on the cognitive effects of noise reveals that it is not volume alone that matters, but predictability. Predictable, consistent background noise, such as white noise or ambient sound, can actually enhance focus for some people by masking unpredictable, intermittent sounds. But unpredictable sounds, especially human speech, are devastating to cognitive performance. A study published in the Journal of Applied Psychology found that overhearing conversations, even conversations you are not part of and have no interest in, reduces cognitive performance by up to 40%. The mechanism is that your brain automatically allocates processing resources to parsing language. This is so deeply hardwired that you cannot voluntarily suppress it. When you hear speech, your brain begins processing it automatically, even if you consciously try to ignore it. This is why open-plan offices are cognitive disaster zones for knowledge work. You are surrounded by speech you did not choose to listen to, and your brain is forced to process it whether you want to or not. The implications for remote work are significant. If you work from home, you must control your auditory environment. This might mean working in a room with a closed door. It might mean using noise-canceling headphones. It might mean working during hours when other members of your household are not present. The specific solution depends on your living situation, but the principle is universal. Unpredictable auditory stimuli, especially speech, must be eliminated during deep work sessions. Some people find that listening to music helps them focus. The research on this is mixed and highly individual. Instrumental music, especially music without lyrics and without dramatic dynamic changes, tends to be neutral or slightly positive for focus. Music with lyrics tends to be negative for tasks that involve language processing, such as writing or reading, because the linguistic processing of the lyrics competes with the linguistic processing of your work. But for tasks that do not involve language, such as coding or visual design, music with lyrics may be neutral or even beneficial for some individuals. The key is self-experimentation. Try different auditory conditions and measure your output. Do not rely on how you feel. Measure what you produce. The social environment represents perhaps the most difficult variable to control, because it involves other people who have their own agendas and expectations. The central challenge is that modern work culture has normalized constant availability. There is an implicit expectation that you will respond to messages within minutes, that you will be available for synchronous communication throughout the workday, and that you will check email and Slack constantly. This expectation is not based on any rational analysis of what actually produces value. It is based on the anxiety of managers who mistake activity for productivity and visibility for output. But this expectation is fundamentally incompatible with deep work. Deep work requires uninterrupted blocks of time. The research suggests that it takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes to enter a flow state. If you are interrupted before that threshold, you never enter the flow state at all. If you are interrupted after entering the flow state, you experience what we discussed earlier as a tension residue, and it takes another 15 to 20 minutes to re-enter the flow state after the interruption. This means that if you are interrupted every hour, you are spending at least half of your time in transition states, never fully engaged in either deep work or the interrupting task. You are permanently operating at reduced capacity. The solution requires setting explicit boundaries and communicating them clearly. You must designate specific blocks of time as deep work time, during which you are unavailable for synchronous communication. This might be 2 hours in the morning before you check email. This might be Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. The specific schedule matters less than the consistency and the clarity of communication. You must tell your colleagues, your manager, and anyone who might try to reach you that you will be unavailable during these blocks and that you will respond to messages after the block ends. This will feel uncomfortable. You will worry that you are being uncooperative or difficult. But if you are a knowledge worker, whose value comes from producing cognitively demanding work, then protecting your ability to do that. Work is not selfishness. It is professionalism. Some people will push back. They will say that your work requires collaboration, that you need to be available for questions, that the team needs to be able to reach you. This is where you must distinguish between urgency and importance. Truly urgent situations, situations that cannot wait 2 hours, are rare. Most things that feel urgent are simply someone else's lack of planning becoming your emergency. If you establish a clear protocol for actual emergencies, such as a phone call rather than a message, you can protect your deep work time while still being available for genuine crises. But you must be willing to let non-urgent things wait. This is a discipline. It is a refusal to be controlled by the urgency preferences of others. The temporal architecture of your day is another critical variable. Cognitive capacity is not constant throughout the day. Most people have a peak cognitive window, usually lasting 2 to 4 hours, during which their brain is operating at maximum capacity. For many people, this window is in the morning, within a few hours of waking. For some people, it is in the late afternoon or evening. The specific timing varies by individual and is partly determined by your chronotype, your genetically influenced preference for mornings or evenings. What does not vary is the principle that you must identify your peak cognitive window and defend it ruthlessly. Your peak cognitive window is your most valuable asset. This is when you should do your deepest work, the work that requires maximum cognitive capacity, the work that creates the most value. This is not the time to check email. This is not the time for meetings. This is not the time for administrative tasks. Those activities should be batched and scheduled for your non-peak hours, the hours when your cognitive capacity is diminished and you can't do deep work effectively anyway. This temporal strategy is not about working more hours. It is about concentrating your best hours on your best work and relegating shallow work to your shallow hours. The neuroscience of Ultradian Rhythms provides additional insight into temporal structuring. The human brain does not operate at constant capacity for extended periods. It operates in cycles called Ultradian Rhythms that last approximately 90 to 120 minutes. During the peak of an Ultradian cycle, you can sustain intense focus. During the trough, your brain needs rest. Many people try to push through the trough, consuming caffeine to override their brain's natural need for recovery. This is counterproductive. The research shows that taking a break during the trough, ideally a break that involves physical movement or rest, rather than different cognitive work, actually accelerates recovery and allows you to enter the next peak with higher capacity. This means that the optimal deep work pattern is not 8 hours of continuous grind, but rather multiple 90-minute blocks of intense focus separated by 15 to 20-minute breaks. The content of these breaks matters. Scrolling social media during a break is not rest. It is different work. And it is work that triggers the addictive dopamine mechanisms we discussed earlier. True rest means disengaging from informational input. Walking is rest. Sitting quietly is rest. Looking out a window is rest. Stretching is rest. These activities allow your brain's default mode network to activate, which is associated with creative insight and memory consolidation. When you are scrolling, your default mode network cannot activate because you are continuously processing new information. This means you are not getting the cognitive recovery that the break is supposed to provide. The dietary and pharmacological variables that influence cognitive performance are complex and often oversimplified in popular advice. Let us start with caffeine. which is the most widely consumed psychoactive substance in the world. Caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors in the brain. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter that accumulates throughout the day and creates the feeling of sleepiness. By blocking adenosine receptors, caffeine prevents you from feeling tired. But caffeine does not create energy. It simply masks the signal that you need rest. This means caffeine is a dead instrument. You can borrow alertness from your future self, but you will eventually have to pay that debt with reduced cognitive capacity when the caffeine wears off and the adenosine that has been accumulating suddenly floods your brain. The strategic use of caffeine for deep work involves understanding this mechanism. If you consume caffeine first thing in the morning, you are blocking adenosine that has accumulated during sleep, which makes sense. But if you consume caffeine continuously throughout the day, you are creating a chronic state of masked fatigue. Your body is tired, but you cannot feel it because the caffeine is blocking the signal. This leads to a pattern where you drink more caffeine to compensate for the fact that you are fundamentally sleep-deprived and over-caffeinated. A more effective strategy is to use caffeine selectively before deep work sessions, and to limit consumption to the first half of your waking hours to avoid interfering with sleep. Caffeine has a half-life of approximately 5 hours, which means that if you consume 200 milligrams of caffeine at 4 p.m., you still have 100 milligrams in your system at 9 p.m. This can delay sleep onset and reduce sleep quality, which reduces your cognitive capacity the following day. Sleep is the foundation variable that determines your cognitive capacity. No amount of environmental optimization or time management can compensate for inadequate sleep. The research on sleep deprivation is unambiguous. Even modest sleep restriction, such as sleeping 6 hours per night instead of 8, produces cumulative cognitive deficits that accumulate over time. A study by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania found that people who slept 6 hours per night for 2 weeks showed cognitive impairment equivalent to people who had been awake for 2 full days. But here is the critical finding. The sleep-deprived subjects did not feel cognitively impaired. They reported feeling only slightly tired, but their performance on cognitive tests was severely degraded. This is the danger of chronic sleep restriction. You lose the ability to accurately assess your own cognitive state. You think you are functioning normally, but you are operating at drastically reduced capacity. The mechanism of sleep's effect on cognition involves multiple systems, each operating during different stages of the sleep cycle. Sleep is not a uniform state, but a complex architecture of stages, each with distinct neurophysiology and distinct functions. The 2 major categories are REM sleep, characterized by rapid eye movements and vivid dreaming, and non-REM sleep, which is further divided into 3 stages: N1, N2, and N3. Also called slow-wave sleep or deep sleep, is the stage most critical for physical restoration and memory consolidation. A typical night of sleep cycles through these stages approximately every 90 minutes, starting with a descent through N1 and N2 into N3, then ascending back through N2 and into REM before the cycle repeats. Early in the night, N3 dominates the cycles. Later in the night, REM dominates. This architecture means that both total sleep duration and sleep timing matter. If you go to bed late and wake early, you truncate sleep from both ends, but you disproportionately lose REM sleep because REM is concentrated in the later cycles. During N3 slow-wave sleep, the brain exhibits large, synchronized delta waves, oscillations of neural activity at approximately 1 to 4 cycles per second. These slow oscillations coordinate the transfer of memories from temporary storage in the hippocampus to long-term storage in the cortex. The molecular mechanism involves a dialogue between the hippocampus and the neocortex. During waking experience, the hippocampus rapidly encodes new memories through synaptic modifications driven by immediate calcium signaling and early-phase long-term potentiation. But these hippocampal memories are temporary, vulnerable to interference from new experiences. During slow-wave sleep, the hippocampus replays these recent memories, reactivating the neural patterns that were active during the original experience. This replay occurs during brief bursts of high-frequency activity called sharp wave ripples. Each sharp wave ripple represents the replay of a memory, compressed in time. An experience that took minutes during wakefulness replays in milliseconds during sleep. These hippocampal replays trigger coordinated activity in the cortex, specifically in the regions that were active during the original experience. If you learned a new programming concept during the day, the cortical regions involved in understanding that concept reactivate during hippocampal replay at night. This coordinated reactivation strengthens the synaptic connections in cortex, gradually building a cortical representation that is independent of the hippocampus. Over multiple nights of sleep, the memory becomes cortical, stable, and integrated with your existing knowledge. This is why people often report that concepts that seemed confusing when first encountered become clear after sleeping on it. The sleep-dependent consolidation process has reorganized the memory, creating more efficient cortical representations and integrating the new information with related knowledge. The research on sleep-dependent memory consolidation is extensive and uses multiple experimental paradigms. In one classic design, participants learn a declarative memory task, such as pairs of words or facts, then either sleep or stay awake for an equivalent period before being tested. The group that sleeps shows significantly better retention than the group that stays awake, even after controlling for circadian rhythm effects by testing at the same time of day. The benefit is not merely from reduced interference during sleep. Active consolidation is occurring. We know this because the benefit is correlated with the amount of slow-wave sleep specifically. Nights with more slow-wave sleep produce stronger memory consolidation. Nights with disrupted slow-wave sleep, even if total sleep time is normal, produce impaired consolidation. For procedural memories, skills that involve motor sequences or perceptual learning, REM sleep plays a particularly important role. During REM sleep, the brain exhibits patterns of activation similar to waking, but with some critical differences. Motor cortex and visual cortex are highly active, but the spinal motor neurons are inhibited, preventing the brain from actually executing the motor commands it is generating. This allows the brain to simulate actions without performing them, a form of offline practice. Studies of musicians learning new pieces show that REM sleep preferentially consolidates the motor sequences involved in playing the instrument. The sequences become smoother, faster, and more automatic after a night of sleep rich in REM. The same effect occurs for athletes learning new movements, for surgeons learning new procedures, and for anyone acquiring any skill that involves coordinated motor control. The sleep architecture changes that occur with chronic sleep restriction. Explain why the deficits accumulate rather than plateau. When you sleep only 6 hours instead of 8, you do not simply get 25% less of each sleep stage. The reduction is not proportional. REM sleep, which is concentrated in the later part of the night, gets disproportionately cut. Over time, you build up what researchers call a REM debt. The brain attempts to compensate by spending more time in REM when you do sleep, a phenomenon called REM rebound. But the compensation is incomplete. The deficit persists. The same is true for slow-wave sleep. While slow-wave sleep is concentrated in the first half of the night, and therefore less vulnerable to late bedtimes, it is vulnerable to sleep fragmentation. If you wake multiple times during the night, even if you fall back asleep quickly, you disrupt the slow-wave cycles. The brain must ascend back through lighter sleep stages before it can re-enter slow-wave sleep, and each disruption costs you minutes of the deep sleep you need for memory consolidation. The consequences for cognitive performance are mechanistically specific. Slow-wave sleep deprivation impairs declarative memory, your ability to recall facts and events. This is mediated by impaired hippocampal function. The hippocampus is one of the most metabolically active regions of the brain and one of the most vulnerable to insufficient sleep. Studies using MRI to measure hippocampal volume show that chronic sleep restriction is associated with reduced hippocampal volume, suggesting actual structural atrophy. This is not just correlation. Sleep deprivation studies in animals show that insufficient sleep reduces neurogenesis in the hippocampus, the birth of new neurons. The hippocampus is one of the few brain regions where new neurons continue to be generated throughout adulthood, and these new neurons are critical for forming new memories. Sleep deprivation shuts down neurogenesis, impairing your capacity to encode new experiences. REM sleep deprivation impairs procedural memory and emotional regulation. The procedural memory impairment is straightforward. Without adequate REM sleep, motor skills consolidate more slowly. You need more practice sessions to achieve the same level of performance. The emotional regulation impairment is mediated by the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. During REM sleep, emotional memories are reprocessed in a way that preserves the factual content while reducing the emotional charge. This is why distressing experiences often feel less intense after sleeping on them. The amygdala activation associated with the memory decreases while the cortical representation is maintained. But when REM sleep is insufficient, emotional memories are not adequately processed. The amygdala remains hyperreactive. You become emotionally volatile, more reactive to minor stressors, more prone to anxiety. This emotional dysregulation impairs decision-making because your affective state biases your judgment. You make choices based on how you feel rather than on rational analysis of the options. The prefrontal cortex is particularly vulnerable to sleep deprivation. Imaging studies show that after a night of insufficient sleep, prefrontal cortex activity is reduced, while amygdala activity is increased. The cortex is supposed to regulate the amygdala, applying executive control to emotional impulses. But sleep deprivation weakens the cortex and disinhibits the amygdala. You become impulsive, emotionally reactive, and poor at self-regulation. All of these effects are the opposite of what you need for deep work. Deep work requires sustained prefrontal engagement, emotional stability, and resistance to distraction. Sleep deprivation undermines all three. The glucose regulation implications of sleep are also significant. Sleep deprivation impairs your body's ability to regulate blood sugar, which means your brain experiences more dramatic blood sugar fluctuations throughout the day. The mechanism involves insulin sensitivity. After even a single night of insufficient sleep, your cells become less responsive to insulin. Insulin is the hormone that signals cells to take up glucose from the bloodstream. When cells are insulin resistant, glucose remains in the blood, causing blood sugar to spike. Eventually, the pancreas secretes more insulin to force the glucose into cells, causing blood sugar to crash. When blood sugar drops, cognitive capacity drops. When blood sugar spikes, you experience a temporary boost, followed by a crash. If you are sleeping adequately, your body can maintain relatively stable blood sugar levels, which provides a stable supply of fuel to your brain. If you are sleep deprived, you are on a blood sugar roller coaster, and your cognitive capacity is rising and falling throughout the day in ways that are difficult to predict or control. The relationship between sleep and insulin sensitivity has been demonstrated in multiple studies. One particularly elegant study restricted healthy young adults to 4 hours of sleep per night for 6 nights. By the end of the restriction period, their glucose clearance rates were 40% slower than baseline, equivalent to the impairment seen in pre-diabetic individuals. This is a massive metabolic disruption from just 6 nights of moderate sleep restriction. The implications extend beyond cognitive performance to long-term health. Chronic sleep restriction is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. These are not separate issues from cognitive performance. They are the same issue viewed at different timescales. In the short term, sleep deprivation impairs your ability to think. In the long term, it damages the metabolic systems that support thinking. The chronobiological dimension of sleep adds another layer of complexity. Your brain has an internal clock, located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, that generates a circadian rhythm of approximately 24 hours. This rhythm regulates not just your sleep-wake cycle, but also your body temperature, hormone secretion, and cognitive performance across the day. The circadian rhythm is entrained to the external, light-dark cycle, primarily through light input to the retina. Special ganglion cells in the retina that contain melanopsin, a photopigment sensitive to blue light, project directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, informing it about environmental light levels. Bright light in the morning advances your circadian phase, making you wake earlier and sleep earlier. Bright light in the evening delays your phase, making you wake later and sleep later. The problem is that modern light exposure patterns are completely misaligned with ancestral patterns. Humans evolved spending daylight hours outside, exposed to bright sunlight that is orders of magnitude brighter than indoor lighting, and spending evening hours in darkness or in the dim light of fire. This created a strong circadian signal: bright light during the day to advance the phase, darkness in the evening to allow melatonin secretion and sleep. But modern life involves spending most daylight hours indoors under relatively dim artificial light, then spending evenings exposed to bright screens that emit substantial blue light. This weak daytime signal, combined with strong evening signal, confuses the circadian system. Your brain receives mixed information about what time of day it is, and your circadian rhythm drifts, often becoming delayed relative to your required sleep schedule. The consequences of circadian misalignment are severe. Social jet lag, the term for the discrepancy between your biological clock and your social obligations, is associated with reduced cognitive performance, mood problems, and metabolic dysfunction. If your circadian rhythm says you should be asleep at 11 p.m., but you regularly stay up until 1 a.m. due to work or social commitments, you are chronically jet-lagged. You are trying to sleep and wake at times that are misaligned with your biology. Sleep at the wrong circadian phase is less restorative because the architecture is disrupted. You spend less time in the sleep stages you need most. Even if you sleep the right duration, sleeping at the wrong time impairs the quality. The solution is to strengthen your circadian signals. Get bright light exposure, ideally sunlight, as early in the day as possible. This advances your phase and helps you wake earlier naturally. If sunlight is not available, bright artificial light can substitute, though it requires much higher intensity than typical indoor lighting. 10,000 lux is the standard recommendation for circadian phase shifting, which is roughly equivalent to being outside on a bright overcast day. In the evening, reduce light exposure, particularly blue light. This means dimming lights and minimizing screen time in the hours before bed. If you must use screens, use blue-blocking filters or glasses. The goal is to create a clear, day-night signal. Bright light during the day, dim light in the evening. This simple intervention can dramatically improve sleep quality and daytime cognitive performance. The nutrition variable is similarly foundational. Your brain consumes approximately 20% of your total energy expenditure, despite representing only 2% of your body mass. This energy comes primarily from glucose. When glucose is stable and adequate, your brain can function optimally. When blood glucose is too low, cognitive capacity declines sharply. When blood glucose spikes and then crashes, you experience the boom and bust cycle of energy and focus. The strategic insight is that stable blood sugar supports stable cognitive capacity, which supports sustained deep work. The problem with typical knowledge worker eating patterns is that they are optimized for convenience rather than cognitive performance. Grabbing a bagel or a muffin for breakfast creates a large glucose spike, which feels like energy, but is followed by a crash within 2 hours. Skipping breakfast altogether seems efficient, but leaves your brain running on depleted fuel from the overnight fast. The optimal strategy for most people involves eating a breakfast that includes protein and fat, which slows glucose absorption and provides sustained energy. This might be eggs, Greek yogurt, or a protein smoothie. The specific food matters less than the macronutrient composition. You want to minimize simple carbohydrates and maximize protein and healthy fats for breakfast and lunch, the meals that precede your peak cognitive work time. Lunch represents a particularly critical decision point. The post-lunch dip in energy and focus that most people experience is partly due to your circadian rhythm, but it is dramatically amplified by what you eat for lunch. A large meal, particularly one high in simple carbohydrates, triggers a substantial insulin release, which drives glucose into cells and can create a relative hypoglycemia, a state where blood glucose drops below baseline. This is why you feel sleepy and unfocused after a big lunch. The meal has temporarily disrupted your blood glucose regulation. A more strategic approach is to eat a smaller lunch focused on protein and vegetables, which provides energy without triggering the insulin spike that leads to the post-lunch crash. Some people find that skipping lunch entirely or eating a very small lunch maximizes their afternoon cognitive capacity. This aligns with research on intermittent fasting, which suggests that being in a mild caloric deficit can enhance focus, possibly because it maintains slightly elevated cortisol and adrenaline levels that promote alertness. The role of exercise in cognitive performance is mediated by multiple mechanisms. Acute exercise, a single bout of physical activity, temporarily increases blood flow to the brain, delivering more oxygen and glucose. This produces a measurable improvement in cognitive performance that lasts for several hours after the exercise ends. The optimal intensity appears to be moderate, enough to elevate heart rate and breathing, but not so intense that you are exhausted afterward. A 20 to 30 minute walk, a light jog, or a brief resistance training session can enhance your cognitive capacity for the subsequent work session. The timing matters. Exercising immediately before a deep work session is strategically optimal because you capture the cognitive boost when you need it most. Chronic exercise, the pattern of regular physical activity over weeks and months, produces more profound and lasting effects on cognition. Regular aerobic exercise increases the volume of your hippocampus, the brain region critical for memory formation. It also increases production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, a protein that promotes the growth and survival of neurons. Higher BDNF levels are associated with better learning capacity and better resistance to cognitive decline. Regular exercise also improves insulin sensitivity, which stabilizes blood glucose regulation and provides your brain with more stable fuel throughout the day. The cognitive benefits of chronic exercise accumulate slowly but are substantial. A meta-analysis of studies on exercise and cognitive function found that regular exercisers show significant advantages in attention, processing speed, and executive function compared to sedentary individuals. The stress variable represents another critical determinant of your capacity for deep work. Stress comes in multiple forms, with different cognitive effects. Acute stress, the stress of facing a challenging task or a tight deadline, can actually enhance focus in the short term. This is mediated by cortisol and adrenaline, hormones that mobilize your body's resources to deal with the challenge. In the right dose, acute stress sharpens attention and enhances performance. This is why many people report doing their best work under deadline pressure. But chronic stress, the stress of ongoing life circumstances that never resolve, has the opposite effect. Chronic elevated cortisol levels damage the hippocampus, impairing memory formation. Chronic stress also impairs prefrontal cortex function, reducing your ability to sustain focus and make good decisions. If you are chronically stressed, your baseline cognitive capacity is reduced, and no amount of environmental optimization will restore it. The distinction between productive stress and destructive stress is crucial. Productive stress is time-limited and under your control. You are stressed because you are working on something difficult, but you have the resources to handle it, and you know it will end when the work is complete. Destructive stress is open-ended and feels outside your control. You are stressed about your financial situation, your relationships, or your health, and you do not see a clear path to resolution. The research shows that the controllability of the stressor is often more important than the magnitude of the stressor. If you feel you have agency, if you believe you can influence the outcome, stress can be motivating. If you feel helpless, stress becomes toxic. The practical implication is that managing your stress is not optional if you want to do deep work. You must identify sources of chronic stress in your life and either resolve them or develop coping mechanisms that prevent them from degrading your cognitive capacity. This might mean addressing relationship conflicts, getting your finances in order, or dealing with health issues you have been avoiding. It might mean developing a meditation practice, which research shows can reduce baseline cortisol levels and improve stress resilience. It might mean reducing your exposure to news and social media, which function as chronic stressors by exposing you to an endless stream of problems you cannot solve. The specific intervention depends on your specific stressors, but the principle is universal. Chronic stress is incompatible with deep work. The technology variable is perhaps the most difficult to address because technology is both the source of distraction and the tool of knowledge work. You need your computer to do your work, but your computer is also the portal to infinite distraction. The solution is not to abandon technology, but to configure technology in a way that supports any deep work rather than undermining it. This requires treating your devices not as general-purpose machines, but as specialized tools configured for specific contexts. The first principle is separation of contexts. Your phone and your computer should have different modes for deep work and for leisure. On your phone, this might mean using iOS focus modes or Android's Do Not Disturb features to silence all notifications during deep work sessions. But simply silencing notifications is not enough. You must also remove the visual cues that trigger the habit of checking. This means removing social media apps from your home screen, or better yet, removing them from your phone entirely and accessing them only via a web browser on your computer. The friction of opening a browser and typing a URL is often enough to break the automatic habit of checking. On your computer, context separation requires more deliberate engineering. If you are writing, your writing application should be in full screen mode, and your browser should be closed. If you need to reference websites for research, you should download the information you need before entering your deep work session. Or you should strictly limit browser use to specific research tasks. The research on self-control suggests that willpower is a depletable resource. Every time you resist the temptation to check email or open a distracting website, you consume willpower. Eventually, your willpower is depleted, and you give in to temptation. The solution is not to rely on willpower, but to eliminate temptation through environmental design. If your email client is closed and takes effort to open, you are less likely to check it impulsively. If your browser is closed and takes effort to open, you are less likely to start browsing random websites. Some knowledge workers find that using separate devices for work and leisure creates the strongest contextual boundary. One computer is used only for work, and it has no social media, no entertainment sites bookmarked, and minimal software beyond what is needed for work tasks. A different device, perhaps a tablet or a second computer, is used for leisure browsing and entertainment. This physical separation creates a psychological barrier that is stronger than any software-based solution. When you sit down at your work computer, your brain knows it is time for work. The context is unambiguous. This is the same principle that sleep researchers recommend for improving sleep. Use your bed only for sleep, never for work or entertainment. So your brain associates the bed exclusively with sleeping. The same principle applies to work and focus. The notification architecture of modern devices is designed to maximize interruptions because interruptions drive engagement, and engagement drives revenue for the platforms that send the notifications. But let us examine the specific economics of the attention marketplace more carefully, because understanding the incentive structure helps you resist its influence. Every major technology platform operates as a two-sided marketplace. On one side are users, who provide attention and behavioral data. On the other side are advertisers, who pay for access to user attention. The platform's business model is to maximize the value extracted from each user by maximizing engagement and maximizing data collection. Every design choice, every algorithm, every notification is optimized for this goal. The attention economy is not metaphorical. It is literal. There is an actual market where your attention is bought and sold. When you scroll through social media, algorithms are predicting which content will keep you scrolling longest. When content causes you to pause and engage, that data feeds back into the algorithm, refining its model of what captures your attention. The algorithm learns your triggers, your interests, your emotional buttons. It becomes increasingly skilled at manipulating your behavior. This is not an accident or a side effect. It is the core product. Facebook does not sell social networking. Facebook sells highly targeted access to user attention based on sophisticated behavioral modeling. Google does not sell search. Google sells intent data, the knowledge of what you are looking for right now, which allows advertisers to place relevant ads at the moment of maximum receptivity. The asymmetry of this market is stark. The platform has teams of engineers, behavioral scientists, and machine learning experts optimizing every aspect of the user experience to maximize engagement. They have access to billions of data points from millions of users. They run thousands of A/B tests to determine what works. You, as an individual user, are competing against this sophisticated system using only your own willpower and awareness. This is not a fair fight. The only way to win is to not play. To structure your relationship with technology such that you are never exposed to the engagement optimization systems. This means using technology instrumentally. It's a tool you pick up when you need it and put down when you do not, rather than as an ambient information stream that flows through your attention continuously. The concept of digital minimalism, articulated by Cal Newport in his 2019 book of the same name, provides a framework for this instrumental relationship. Digital minimalism is not about using less technology. It is about using technology intentionally, starting from your values and goals, then adopting only the digital tools that serve those goals, and using those tools in specific ways that enhance rather than detract from your ability to live according to your values. This requires actively auditing your technology use, identifying which tools actually contribute value, and ruthlessly eliminating those that do not. For most people, this audit reveals that social media contributes minimal value relative to its cost in attention and time. The value it provides, staying loosely connected to acquaintances, and accessing certain types of information can often be achieved through alternative means that do not involve exposure to algorithmic feeds designed to capture your attention. The attention training protocols that have been developed by contemplative neuroscience research provide another tool for increasing your capacity for deep work. Meditation, particularly focused attention meditation, where you sustain attention on a single object such as your breath, is essentially attention training. When your mind wanders, which it will, you notice the wandering and gently redirect your attention back to the object of focus. This is the same skill required for deep work, noticing when your attention has drifted and redirecting it back to your task. Research shows that regular meditation practice, even just 10 to 15 minutes per day, produces measurable improvements in sustained attention and reduces susceptibility to distraction. The mechanism is that meditation strengthens the brain's attentional networks, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, which are involved in executive control and monitoring of attention. The specific form of meditation that is most beneficial for deep work is concentration practice, also called focused attention meditation. In this practice, you choose an object of focus, typically the breath, and maintain attention on that object continuously. When you notice your attention has wandered, you return it to the breath without judgment. The object itself is not important. What matters is the repeated exercise of noticing distraction and returning to focus. This is the fundamental cognitive operation that underlies all sustained attention. Every time you bring your attention back, you are strengthening the neural circuits responsible for attention control. Over hundreds or thousands of repetitions, These circuits become more efficient, making it easier to sustain focus and easier to return to focus after distraction. The research on meditation and attention is extensive. A meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin in 2018 analyzed studies of meditation and cognitive function involving over 23,000 participants. The analysis found consistent improvements in attention, working memory, and executive function among meditators compared to controls. The effect sizes were modest, but significant. And importantly, the benefits persisted outside of meditation itself. People who meditated regularly showed improved attention during normal waking activities. The training generalized. This is exactly what you would hope for if you are using meditation as a tool to enhance your capacity for deep work. You are not trying to become a meditation expert. You are trying to strengthen the underlying cognitive capacities that support sustained focus. The transfer effects from meditation to work are not automatic. Sitting in meditation for 30 minutes does not directly make you better at writing code or analyzing data. But meditation trains the meta skill of attention control, and that meta skill applies to all cognitively demanding tasks. If you can sustain attention on your breath for 5 minutes, without your mind wandering, you are building the neural infrastructure that allows you to sustain attention on your work for 90 minutes without your mind wandering. The practice is the same practice. You are training your brain to resist the pull of distraction, to notice when you have been pulled away, and to bring yourself back. This is the fundamental skill of deep work. Some research suggests that mindfulness meditation, where you maintain open awareness of all experience rather than focusing on a single object, may be less effective for building sustained attention, but more effective for reducing the emotional reactivity that often accompanies distraction. When you get distracted during deep work, you often experience frustration or self-criticism, which creates negative associations with the work and makes it harder to sustain effort. Mindfulness training reduces this reactivity, allowing you to notice distraction without judgment and return to the task without emotional turmoil. The ideal approach may be to combine both practices: focused attention, meditation to build concentration capacity, and mindfulness meditation to reduce reactivity to distraction. The progression model for developing deep work capacity resembles the progression model for physical training. You cannot immediately run a marathon if you have been sedentary. You must build your capacity gradually. The same is true for attention. If you are accustomed to checking your phone every few minutes and switching tasks constantly, you cannot immediately sit down and do focused work for 4 hours. You must start with shorter deep work sessions and gradually extend them as your capacity increases. This might mean starting with 30-minute blocks of focused work, then extending to 60 minutes, then 90 minutes, and eventually to 2 or 3 hours. The progression should be gradual enough that you can succeed consistently, building positive associations with deep work, but challenging enough that you are pushing your current capacity. The specific protocol for this progression should be systematic. Begin by establishing a baseline. For 1 week, track your current capacity for sustained focus without trying to change it. Use a simple timer and note how long you can work before you feel the urge to check your phone or switch tasks. Record this for multiple work sessions across different days. Calculate your average sustained focus time. This is your baseline. Now set your initial deep work goal at roughly 75% of your baseline. If your baseline is 20 minutes, your initial goal is 15 minutes. This ensures early success. For 2 weeks, practice 15-minute deep work blocks, aiming to complete at least 2 or 3 per day. After 2 weeks, if you are consistently achieving this goal without struggle, increase to 20 minutes. Continue this pattern, increasing by 5 minutes every 2 weeks until you reach your target capacity. The measurement of your deep work practice is critical. You cannot manage what you do not measure. This means tracking both the quantity and quality of your deep work. Quantity is straightforward. How many hours per day or per week did you spend in deep work? Quality is more subjective, but still measurable. How focused did you feel during those hours? Did you achieve flow, or were you struggling to concentrate? Were you frequently distracted, or did you maintain sustained attention? You can use a simple scale, rating each deep work session from 1 to 5 based on how deeply focused you were. Over time, patterns will emerge. You will notice that certain conditions produce higher quality deep work, and you can optimize for those conditions. The data you collect should also include contextual variables: what time of day you worked, what you ate beforehand, how much you slept the night before, whether you exercised, what your environment was like. This allows you to run experiments on yourself. You might discover that you do your best work between 8 and 11 a.m., or that eating a high-protein lunch enhances your afternoon focus, or that a 10-minute walk before work dramatically improves your concentration. These insights are specific to you and cannot be derived from general advice. You must experiment and measure. The scientific method applies to personal optimization just as it applies to laboratory research. You form a hypothesis about what might improve your focus. You test that hypothesis through systematic experimentation. You collect data, and you draw conclusions. The concept of keystone habits, introduced by Charles Duhigg in The Power of Habit, is particularly relevant to building a deep work practice. Keystone habits are habits that trigger chain reactions, helping other good habits fall into place. Exercise is often a keystone habit. When people start exercising regularly, they often find themselves eating better, sleeping better, and being more productive, not because they set out to change all these behaviors, but because exercise triggers a virtuous cycle. Sleep can also be a keystone habit. When you prioritize sleep, you have more willpower, make better decisions, and are less susceptible to distraction, all of which support deep work. The strategic insight is that you should identify which habit has the greatest leverage in your life and focus on establishing that habit first. If you are chronically sleep-deprived, no amount of time management or environmental optimization will compensate. Fix your sleep first, then build deep work habits on that foundation. If you are chronically stressed, address the sources of stress first, then work on focus. The order matters. Trying to build deep work capacity while sleep-deprived is like trying to run a marathon with a broken leg. You are fighting your biology. Establish the foundation habits that support cognitive function. Then, build the higher-order habits of focus and attention control. The social reinforcement of deep work practices can accelerate your progress. If you are part of a community of people who value deep work, you receive social proof that what you are doing is valuable, and you are exposed to role models who have already achieved what you are working toward. This is why many elite performers seek out mentors and communities of practice. They want to be around people who are operating at the level they aspire to. If everyone around you is constantly distracted, constantly multitasking, and constantly available for interruptions, it is hard to maintain the belief that deep work is valuable. But if you are part of a community where deep work is the norm, where people protect their focus time and celebrate cognitive accomplishments, your own practice is reinforced. Online communities can serve this function if in-person communities are not available. There are forums, Discord servers, and social media groups dedicated to deep work, productivity, and focused learning. These communities share strategies, report their progress, and hold each other accountable. The key is to find a community that shares your values and your definition of success. Some productivity communities are focused on quantity, on how many hours you work or how many tasks you complete. These communities can create unhealthy competitive dynamics where people burn themselves out trying to work more than their peers. The communities that are most valuable for deep work are focused on quality, on the depth of focus achieved, and the significance of the work produced. They celebrate mastery, not hustle. They recognize that deep work is about working intelligently, not just working intensely. The integration of deep work into your career strategy is where the long-term payoff becomes clear. Deep work is not just about being more productive in your current role. It is about building career capital, the rare and valuable skills that give you leverage in the job market. In an economy where routine cognitive work is being automated, the people who can do non-routine cognitive work at an elite level have increasing leverage. They can command higher salaries, better working conditions, and more autonomy. But developing elite-level skills requires deep work. There is no shortcut. You cannot master complex skills through shallow practice. You must engage in deliberate practice at the edge of your ability, which requires sustained focus. Cal Newport's career capital theory, which he developed in his 2012 book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, provides the framework. Career capital is the skills, connections, and credentials that you accumulate over your career. The more valuable your career capital, the more leverage you have in negotiations with employers, the more opportunities are available to you, and the more freedom you have to shape your career on your own terms. But career capital is not distributed equally. Some forms of career capital are common, and therefore low value. Many people can do basic data entry or answer customer service calls. These skills command low wages because the supply of people who can do them exceeds demand. But some forms of career capital are rare and therefore high value. Few people can architect complex distributed systems or perform advanced statistical analysis or write compelling narrative nonfiction. These skills command high compensation because demand exceeds supply. The question is how you acquire rare and valuable skills. Newport's answer is deliberate practice, which is essentially deep work applied to skill development. Deliberate practice is not the same as ordinary practice. Ordinary practice is comfortable repetition of what you already know how to do. Deliberate practice is uncomfortable stretching toward the edge of your current ability. It requires focus, immediate feedback, and continuous adjustment. It is mentally exhausting, which is why most people avoid it, and why elite performers who engage in it consistently develop skills far beyond the norm. The research on deliberate practice, primarily conducted by Anders Ericsson and colleagues over several decades, shows that expert performance in virtually every domain is the result of thousands of hours of deliberate practice, not innate talent. The compound returns of deep work over a career are exponential. If you dedicate 2 hours per day to deep work, focused on mastering your craft, you will accumulate 730 hours per year of high-quality practice. Over a decade, that is 7,300 hours. Malcolm Gladwell popularized the idea that 10,000 hours of practice is required to achieve mastery based on Ericsson's research. But Erickson's actual research shows that it is not just hours, but quality of practice that matters. 10,000 hours of shallow practice will not make you elite. But 7,000 hours of deep practice, practice that pushes you to the edge of your current ability and forces you to grow, can absolutely make you elite. And because most people are not doing deep work, because most people are distracted and fragmented, your deep work hours are competing against a mediocre field. The bar for elite performance is lower than you think, because so few people are willing to do the hard work of sustained focus. The economic value of this mastery increases as AI systems become more capable. AI is very good at routine cognitive work that follows established patterns and can be broken down into explicit steps. A large language model can write serviceable prose, generate functional code for common tasks, analyze data according to standard methods. But AI is not yet good at work that requires creative insight, that requires synthesizing information from multiple domains to generate genuinely novel solutions, that requires understanding subtle human contexts and emotional dynamics, or that requires making judgments in ambiguous situations where there is no clear right answer. These are the domains where human cognitive advantage remains, and they are all domains that require deep work to develop. If you can become elite at work that AI cannot do, you have job security and increasing economic leverage. The demand for people who can do this work will increase as AI handles more of the routine work. The supply of people who can do this work will remain limited because it requires capabilities that most people do not develop. This supply-demand imbalance creates pricing power. You can command high compensation because you are providing value that is both high and scarce. But if you remain in the realm of routine cognitive work, you are in a race to the bottom against automation. Every year, AI systems become more capable, and the range of routine work they can handle expands. Your skills become less valuable over time as machines learn to replicate them. The philosophical dimension of deep work is often overlooked, but may be the most important. Deep work is not just economically valuable, it is existentially meaningful. Human beings are wired to find satisfaction in mastery, in growth, in the experience of flow. When you do deep work, you are engaging with life at the highest level of intensity. You are using your cognitive capacity to its fullest extent. You are creating something that did not exist before. This is fundamentally different from the passive consumption of content, the shallow skimming of information, or the fragmented multitasking that fills most people's days. Deep work is active. It is generative. It is the opposite of entropy. The research on meaning and well-being consistently shows that people derive more satisfaction from challenging, engaging activities than from easy, pleasant activities. Watching television is pleasant in the moment, but it produces no lasting satisfaction. Completing a difficult project, solving a hard problem, or mastering a complex skill produces deep satisfaction that persists. This aligns with what Csikszentmihalyi called the autotelic experience, the experience of an activity that is rewarding in itself rather than as a means to an external end. When you are in flow, when you are fully absorbed in deep work, you are not thinking about the outcome. You are not working for the paycheck or the promotion or the recognition. You are working because the work itself is engaging. This is the highest form of human experience. The existentialist philosophers, particularly Sartre and Camus, argued that meaning is not given, but created through committed action. You do not find meaning by contemplating abstract questions. You create meaning by engaging deeply with projects that require your full attention and capacity. Deep work is a form of committed action. When you dedicate hours to mastering a difficult skill or producing a significant work, you are asserting through your actions that this matters, that it is worth the effort, that you are willing to sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term achievement. This act of commitment, sustained over time, is what creates a meaningful life. The cultural shift required to prioritize deep work over constant connectivity represents a collective action problem. As long as most people operate in a mode of constant availability and fragmented attention, there is pressure on everyone to conform to that norm. If you protect your focus time and refuse to be constantly available, you risk being seen as uncooperative or not a team player. But if enough people refuse to participate in the culture of constant distraction, the culture shifts. This is already happening in some organizations and some communities. There are companies that have instituted no-meeting days, that have eliminated email in favor of more structured communication systems, that have created norms around protecting deep work time. These organizations are not just more productive, they are more humane. They create environments where people can do their best work without burning out. The individual agency you have in this cultural shift is significant. You cannot change your entire organization overnight, but you can change your own practices. You can start protecting your mornings for deep work. You can start batching your email. You can start saying no to meetings that do not create value. And when you do these things, you model a different way of working. Other people notice. Some of them will ask you how you manage to get so much done. Some of them will start adopting similar practices. Culture changes one person at a time, and you can be one of the people who changes it. The long-term trajectory of someone who masters deep work is radically different from someone who does not. Consider two knowledge workers starting their careers at the same time with the same baseline skills. One commits to 2 hours of deep work per day, accumulating 730 hours per year of focused skill development. The other operates in reactive mode, responding to emails and attending meetings, accumulating perhaps 100 hours per year of actual focused work. After 1 year, the gap is already significant. The first person has developed substantially more expertise. After 5 years, the gap is massive. The first person has built rare and valuable skills that command high compensation. The second person has remained in the realm of routine work that is increasingly automated. After 10 years, they are operating in different worlds. The first person has autonomy, influence, and financial security. The second person is competing for a shrinking pool of routine jobs. This is not speculation. This pattern has been observed and documented in multiple studies of career trajectories. The research on income inequality reveals that the distribution of outcomes within occupations has become more unequal over the past several decades. The spread between the highest earners and the median earners in most knowledge work fields has increased. Part of this is driven by winner-take-all dynamics in globalized markets, but part of it is driven by the increasing returns to rare skills. If you can do work that very few others can do, you can capture a larger share of the value you create. Deep work is the mechanism for developing those rare skills. The meta skill of learning how to learn is perhaps the ultimate application of deep work. In a world that is changing rapidly, where new technologies and new domains of knowledge emerge constantly, the ability to master new skills quickly is more valuable. than any specific skill you currently have. Today's valuable skill may be obsolete in 5 years, but the ability to learn new skills never becomes obsolete. And learning is fundamentally a deep work task. You cannot master complex subjects through fragmented, distracted study. You must engage deeply, building mental models, making connections, testing your understanding. This requires sustained focus over extended periods. The research on expertise acquisition shows that the most effective learning happens at the edge of your current ability, in what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. If you are working on tasks that are too easy, you are not learning. You are simply executing what you already know, which feels comfortable but produces no growth. If you are working on tasks that are too hard, you become frustrated and give up. But if you can find the zone where the task is just beyond your current ability, where you have to stretch but you can succeed, you are in the optimal learning zone. This zone is uncomfortable. It requires effort and concentration. It is the opposite of passive consumption of content. But this is where growth happens, and accessing this zone requires deep work, because the moment you become distracted, you fall out of the zone. The task becomes too hard because you do not have enough working memory capacity to juggle all the elements. You give up and you learn nothing. The opportunity cost framework is the final lens through which to evaluate your relationship with deep work. Every hour you spend in fragmented, distracted, shallow work is an hour you did not spend building the skills that will define your career and your life. The cost is not just the value you could have created today. The cost is the compounded value you could have created over the years and decades to come. If you spend 5 years operating in a mode of constant distraction, you do not just lose 5 years of potential growth. You lose the compounded advantage that 5 years of deliberate skill building would have created. You do not become one of the people who has elite skills. You remain one of the people competing in the crowded middle, where the economic returns are diminishing and the risk of automation is highest. The alternative is to treat attention as your most valuable asset, and to architect your life around protecting and directing that attention toward what matters most. This is not easy. It requires saying no to things that everyone else says yes to. It requires tolerance for short-term discomfort, the discomfort of FOMO, the discomfort of not being constantly in the loop, the discomfort of doing hard cognitive work rather than easy distraction. But the long-term payoff is a life of mastery, autonomy, and meaning. You become someone who can produce valuable work. You become someone who continues to grow and adapt as the world changes. You become someone who experiences the deep satisfaction of operating at the highest level of human cognitive capacity. Understanding the system is the first step to changing it. You now understand the economic incentives that profit from your fragmentation. You understand the neurochemical mechanisms that make distraction addictive. You understand the cognitive architecture of deep work and flow states. You understand the environmental, temporal, social, and technological variables that influence your capacity for sustained focus. And you understand that this capacity is not fixed. It is a skill that can be trained, a system that can be optimized, a practice that can be refined over years and decades. The question is not whether you can do deep work. The question is whether you will. Join the ranks. The notification architecture of modern devices is designed to maximize interruptions because interruptions drive engagement, and engagement drives revenue for the platforms that send the notifications. The default notification settings on phones and computers are hostile to deep work. Every app wants permission to send you notifications, and every notification is an MLS, interruption of your focus. The solution is simple in principle, but requires discipline to implement. Disable all notifications except for messages from people you care about and actual emergencies. This means no notifications from social media, no notifications from news apps, no notifications from games, no notifications from shopping apps. If there is information you need, you can check for it intentionally during your breaks or after your deep work session. But you should not allow every app to interrupt you whenever it wants your attention. The email problem deserves special attention because email is often a required component of knowledge work, but it is also one of the most destructive forces acting against deep work. The average knowledge worker receives over 100 emails per day, according to multiple surveys. If you respond to emails as they arrive, you are interrupted more than 100 times per day. This makes deep work impossible. The solution is to process email in batches during specific times rather than continuously throughout the day. This might mean checking email 3 times per day, once in mid-morning after your first deep work session, once after lunch, and once in the late afternoon before you finish work. During your deep work sessions, your email client is closed, and you are unreachable by email. This batch processing approach to email creates anxiety for many people because we have been conditioned to believe that immediate responsiveness is a virtue. But this belief is not based on evidence. Research on email response times shows that most emails do not require immediate responses. The person who sent the email is not sitting there waiting for your reply. They sent the email and moved on to something else. They will see your response when they next check their email, which might be hours later. The expectation of immediate response is mostly in your own head, created by the anxiety of having unread messages. But if you communicate clearly about your email schedule, setting an autoresponder that says you check email 3 times per day and will respond within 24 hours, most people adapt quickly. And the people who cannot adapt, the people who demand immediate response, are often the people whose demands are least aligned with what actually creates value in your work. The meeting problem is structurally similar to the email problem. Meetings fragment your day into pieces that are too small for deep work. If you have a meeting at 10 a.m. and another meeting at 2 p.m., you have fragmented your day into 3 pieces: before 10, between 10 and 2, and after 2. Research on time perception suggests that you need at least 3 to 4 hours of uninterrupted time to do meaningful deep work. If your longest uninterrupted block is shorter than that, you are consigned to shallow work. The solution is to batch meetings into specific days or specific parts of the day. This might mean having a meeting day where all your recurring meetings are scheduled, leaving other days completely free. Or it might mean having office hours where you are available for meetings during a specific afternoon window, but the rest of your time is protected. This requires negotiating with others, and many people feel they do not have the political capital to restructure their meeting obligations. But you have more control than you think. Most meetings are not productive. Research suggests that over half of meeting time is wasted. People call meetings because it is the default action when they want input or want to feel like they are making progress. But many meetings could be replaced by a brief written communication. If you are invited to a meeting and you are not clear on why you are needed, ask the organizer to send you the agenda and the specific questions they need your input on. Often, you will find that you can provide that input via email in 5 minutes, saving you the hour the meeting would have consumed. Some meetings are genuinely necessary for collaboration and decision-making, but many are not. and you can reclaim significant time by pushing back strategically. The attention training protocols that have been developed by contemplative neuroscience research provide another tool for increasing your capacity for deep work. Meditation, particularly focused attention meditation, where you sustain attention on a single object such as your breath, is essentially attention training. When your mind wanders, which it will, you notice the wandering and gently redirect your attention back to the object of focus. This is the same skill required for deep work, noticing when your attention has drifted and redirecting it back to your task. Research shows that regular meditation practice, even just 10 to 15 minutes per day, produces measurable improvements in sustained attention and reduces susceptibility to distraction. The mechanism is that meditation strengthens the brain's attentional networks, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, which are involved in executive control and monitoring of attention. The transfer effects from meditation to work are not automatic. Sitting in meditation for 30 minutes does not directly make you better at writing code or analyzing data. But meditation trains the meta skill of attention control, and that meta skill applies to all cognitively demanding tasks. If you can sustain attention on your breath for 5 minutes without your mind wandering, you are building the neural infrastructure that allows you to sustain attention on your work for 90 minutes without your mind wandering. The practice is the same practice. You are training your brain to resist the pull of distraction, to notice when you have been pulled away, and to bring yourself back. This is the fundamental skill of deep work. Some research suggests that mindfulness meditation, where you maintain open awareness of all experience rather than focusing on a single object, may be less effective for building sustained attention, but more effective for reducing the emotional reactivity that often accompanies distraction. When you get distracted during deep work, you often experience frustration or self-criticism, which creates negative associations with the work and makes it harder to sustain effort. Mindfulness training reduces this reactivity, allowing you to notice distraction without judgment and return to the task without emotional turmoil. The ideal approach may be to combine both practices: focused attention, meditation to build concentration capacity, and mindfulness meditation to reduce reactivity to distraction. The progression model for developing deep work capacity resembles the progression model for physical training. You cannot immediately run a marathon if you have been sedentary. You must build your capacity gradually. The same is true for attention. If you are accustomed to checking your phone every few minutes and switching tasks constantly, you can't immediately sit down and do focused work for 4 hours. You must start with shorter deep work sessions and gradually extend them as your capacity increases. This might mean starting with 30-minute blocks of focused work, then extending to 60 minutes, then 90 minutes, and eventually to 2 or 3 hours. The progression should be gradual enough that you can succeed consistently, building positive associations with deep work, but challenging enough that you are pushing your current capacity. The measurement of your deep work practice is critical. You cannot manage what you do not measure. This means tracking both the quantity and quality of your deep work. Quantity is straightforward. How many hours per day or per week did you spend in deep work? Quality is more subjective, but still measurable. How focused did you feel during those hours? Did you achieve flow, or were you struggling to concentrate? Were you frequently distracted, or did you maintain sustained attention? You can use a simple scale, rating each deep work session from 1 to 5, based on how deeply focused you were. Over time, patterns will emerge. You will notice that certain conditions produce higher quality deep work, and you can optimize for those conditions. The data you collect should also include contextual variables: what time of day you worked, what you ate beforehand, how much you slept the night before, whether you exercised, what your environment was like. This data allows you to run experiments on yourself. You might discover that you do your best work between 8 and 11 a.m., or that eating a high-protein lunch enhances your afternoon focus, or that a 10-minute walk before work dramatically improves your concentration. These insights are specific to you and cannot be derived from general advice. You must experiment and measure. The social reinforcement of deep work practices can accelerate your progress. If you are part of a community of people who value deep work, you receive social proof that what you are doing is valuable, and you are exposed to role models who have already achieved what you are working toward. This is why many elite performers seek out mentors and communities of practice. They want to be around people who are operating at the level they aspire to. If everyone around you is constantly distracted, constantly multitasking, and constantly available for interruptions, it is hard to maintain the belief that deep work is valuable. But if you are part of a community where deep work is the norm, where people protect their focus time and celebrate cognitive accomplishments, your own practice is reinforced. Online communities can serve this function if in-person communities are not available. There are forums, Discord servers, and social media groups dedicated to deep work, productivity, and focused learning. These communities share strategies, report their progress, and hold each other accountable. The key is to find a community that shares your values and your definition of success. Some productivity communities are focused on quantity, on how many hours you work or how many tasks you complete. These communities can create unhealthy competitive dynamics. The communities that are most valuable for deep work are focused on quality, on the depth of focus achieved, and the significance of the work produced. They celebrate mastery, not hustle. The integration of deep work into your career strategy is where the long-term payoff becomes clear. Deep work is not just about being more productive in your current role. It is about building career capital, the rare and valuable skills that give you leverage in the job market. In an economy where routine cognitive work is being automated, the people who can do non-routine cognitive work at an elite level have increasing leverage. They can command higher salaries, better working conditions, and more autonomy. But developing elite-level skills requires deep work. There is no shortcut. You cannot master complex skills through shallow practice. You must engage in deliberate practice at the edge of your ability, which requires sustained focus. The compound returns of deep work over a career are exponential. If you dedicate 2 hours per day to deep work focused on mastering your craft, you will accumulate 730 hours per year of high-quality practice. Over a decade, that is 7,300 hours. Malcolm Gladwell popularized the idea that 10,000 hours of practice is required to achieve mastery, based on Anders Ericsson's research. But Ericsson's actual research shows that it is not just hours, but quality of practice that matters. 10,000 hours of shallow practice will not make you elite. But 7,000 hours of deep practice, practice that pushes you to the edge of your current ability and forces you to grow, can absolutely make you elite. And because most people are not doing deep work, because most people are distracted and fragmented, your deep work hours are competing against a mediocre field. The bar for elite performance is lower than you think, because so few people are willing to do the hard work of sustained focus. The economic value of this mastery increases as AI systems become more capable. It's very good at routine cognitive work that follows established patterns and can be broken down into explicit steps. But AI is not yet good at work that requires creative insight, that requires synthesizing information from multiple domains, that requires understanding subtle human contexts, or that requires making judgments in ambiguous situations. These are the domains where human cognitive advantage remains, and they are all domains that require deep work to develop. If you can become elite at work that AI cannot do, you have job security and increasing economic leverage. If you remain in the realm of routine cognitive work, you are in a race to the bottom against automation. The philosophical dimension of deep work is often overlooked, but may be the most important. Deep work is not just economically valuable, it is existentially meaningful. Human beings are wired to find satisfaction in mastery, in growth, in the experience of flow. When you do deep work, you are engaging with life at the highest level of intensity. You are using your cognitive capacity to its fullest extent. You are creating something that did not exist before. This is fundamentally different from the passive consumption of content, the shallow skimming of information, or the fragmented multitasking that fills most people's days. Deep work is active. It is generative. It is the opposite of entropy. The research on meaning and well-being consistently shows that people derive more satisfaction from challenging, engaging activities than from easy, pleasant activities. Watching television is pleasant in the moment, but it produces no lasting satisfaction. Completing a difficult project, solving a hard problem, or mastering a complex skill produces deep satisfaction that persists. This aligns with what Csikszentmihalyi called the autotelic experience, the experience of an activity that is rewarding in itself rather than as a means to an external end. When you are in flow, when you are fully absorbed in deep work, you are not thinking about the outcome. You are not working for the paycheck, or the promotion, or the recognition. You are working because the work itself is engaging. This is the highest form of human experience. The cultural shift required to prioritize deep work over constant connectivity represents a collective action problem. As long as most people operate in a mode of constant availability and fragmented attention, there is pressure on everyone to conform to that norm. If you protect your focus time and refuse to be constantly available, you risk being seen as uncooperative or not a team player. But if enough people refuse to participate in the culture of constant distraction, the culture shifts. This is already happening in some organizations and some communities. There are companies that have instituted no meeting days, that have eliminated email in favor of more structured communication systems, that have created norms around protecting deep work time. These organizations are not just more productive, they are more humane. They create environments where people can do their best work without burning out. The individual agency you have in this cultural shift is significant. You cannot change your entire organization overnight, but you can change your own practices. You can start protecting your mornings for deep work. You can start batching your email. You can start saying no to meetings that do not create value. And when you do these things, you model a different way of working. Other people notice. Some of them will ask you how you manage to get so much done. Some of them will start adopting similar practices. Culture changes one person at a time, and you can be one of the people who changes it. The meta skill of learning how to learn is perhaps the ultimate application of deep work. In a world that is changing rapidly, where new technologies and new domains of knowledge emerge constantly, the ability to master new skills quickly is more valuable than any specific skill you currently have. Today's valuable skill may be obsolete in 5 years, but the ability to learn new skills never becomes obsolete. And learning is fundamentally a deep work task. You cannot master complex subjects through fragmented, distracted study. You must engage deeply, building mental models, making connections, testing your understanding. This requires sustained focus over extended periods. The research on expertise acquisition shows that the most effective learning happens at the edge of your current ability, in what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. If you are working on tasks that are too easy, you are not learning. If you are working on tasks that are too hard, you become frustrated and give up. But if you can find the zone where the task is just beyond your current ability, where you have to stretch but you can succeed, you're in the optimal learning zone. This zone is uncomfortable. It requires effort and concentration. It is the opposite of passive consumption of content. But this is where growth happens. And accessing this zone requires deep work, because the moment you become distracted, you fall out of the zone. The task becomes too hard because you do not have enough working memory capacity to juggle all the elements. You give up, and you learn nothing. The opportunity cost framework is the final lens through which to evaluate your relationship with deep work. Every hour you spend in fragmented, distracted, shallow work is an hour you did not spend building the skills that will define your career and your life. The cost is not just the value you could have created today. The cost is the compounded value you could have created over the years and decades to come. If you spend 5 years operating in a mode of constant distraction, you do not just lose 5 years of potential growth. You lose the compounded advantage that 5 years of deliberate skill building would have created. You do not become one of the people who has elite skills. You remain one of the people competing in the crowded middle, where the economic returns are diminishing and the risk of automation is highest. The alternative is to treat attention as your most valuable asset, and to architect your life around protecting and directing that attention toward what matters most. This is not easy. It requires saying no to things that everyone else says yes to. It requires tolerance for short-term discomfort, the discomfort of FOMO, the discomfort of not being constantly in the loop, the discomfort of doing hard cognitive work rather than easy distraction. But the long-term payoff is a life of mastery, autonomy, and meaning. You become someone who can produce valuable work. You become someone who continues to grow and adapt as the world changes. You become someone who experiences the deep satisfaction of operating at the highest level of human cognitive capacity. Understanding the system is the first step to changing it. You now understand the economic incentives that profit from your fragmentation. You understand the neurochemical mechanisms that make distraction addictive. You understand the cognitive architecture of deep work and flow states. You understand the environmental, temporal, social, and technological variables that influence your capacity for sustained focus. And you understand that this capacity is not fixed. It is a skill that can be trained, a system that can be optimized, a practice that can be refined over years and decades. The question is not whether you can do deep work. The question is whether